The clock on the microwave read 6:42 a.m. when I saw them. I was standing at the kitchen sink, nursing a cup of black coffee, watching the thin, morning mist burn off the tops of the Douglas firs that crowded my property line. It was a ritual, this quiet moment before the day truly began, or a moment of peace. And on that Tuesday, it was shattered by the sight of two men in fluorescent yellow vests and a woman in a crisp, white pantsuit standing at the mouth of my driveway. My driveway. The one that cut through 150 acres of my timberland. They were standing next to a large, black, wrought iron gate that was, as of that moment, being permanently installed across the gravel road. I didn't move. I just watched, the ceramic of the mug warm against my palms. I saw her pointing, gesturing with sharp, emphatic movements. She was a woman who was accustomed to pointing, to directing, to having the world rearrange itself to her satisfaction. The men were using a post hole digger, sinking thick metal posts into the earth on either side of the road. My earth. I had paid taxes on that specific patch of dirt for 43 years. My father had paid them for 20 years before that. On paper, in the clear, unambiguous language of deeds and surveys filed with the county, that road was as much a part of my property as the floorboards under my feet. I took another slow sip of coffee. The logical part of my brain, the part that had spent a lifetime as a civil engineer and licensed land surveyor, was already cataloging the details. The make of the truck, a Ford F250 with a magnetic sign for prestige fencing. The lack of any visible permit posted. The precise location of the gate, approximately 10 feet inside my own, clearly marked property line. I set the mug down, picked up my phone, and started recording. I didn't zoom in. I just held it steady, capturing the wide shot of the scene, the early morning light painting everything in soft blues and grays. After a few minutes, I walked outside. I didn't slam the door. I didn't shout. I just walked down the long path from my house, my worn leather boots making soft, crunching sounds on the gravel. The air was cool and smelled of pine and damp earth. As I approached, the woman in the pantsuit turned. She had a tight, professionally pleasant smile that didn't reach her eyes. She was Karen Blackwood, the president of the Crestwood Pines Homeowners Association, the sprawling, aspirational development that bordered the eastern edge of my land. "Good morning," she said, her voice carrying an unnatural brightness. "Wonderful day, isn't it? We're just getting this new security gate installed. It's going to be a real asset to the community." I stopped about 15 feet away, my phone still held loosely at my side, still recording. I didn't say anything. I just looked at the gate, then at the men working, then back at her. Her smile tightened a fraction. "This is just a formality, of course," she continued, her tone shifting from cheerful to condescending. "This is the primary access road for our new Pioneer Cabins development. For security and insurance purposes, the HOA board voted to make it a gated entrance. All residents and registered guests will have a key fob." She paused, as if expecting me to be impressed. I remained silent. I let the quiet of the forest press in around us. "Look," she said, the pleasantness now completely gone, replaced by a sharp, impatient edge. "Let's not make this difficult. We both know this road has been used by Crestwood residents for years. Historic use creates a prescriptive easement. That's settled law. This gate is going up. You will be issued one courtesy key fob, but you are not to distribute it. Any interference with this installation will be reported to the sheriff as criminal trespassing and destruction of HOA property. Our lawyers will be in touch about fining you for any delays." She gestured to the gate as if it were a monument she had just unveiled. "This is now officially Crestwood Pines property." I finally lowered my phone, tapped the screen to stop the recording, and slid it into my pocket. I looked her directly in the eye. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't argue. I simply let her statement hang in the air, a perfect, self-incriminating artifact. I had the video. I had her on the record statement, identifying herself, her authority, and her flawed legal theory. It was all I needed from this particular interaction. She mistook my silence for submission. A triumphant little smirk played on her lips. She turned her back on me and began directing the workmen again, her voice sharp and commanding. I turned and walked back to my house. The coffee I had left on the counter was cold, but I drank it anyway. As I stood there, looking out the window at the new, black iron gate being cemented into my land, a single thought echoed in my mind. She had just spent HOA money to build a beautiful, sturdy, and entirely legal fence, and then she locked it. She had no idea she had just locked the only road in, trapping her own multi-million-dollar venture on my land. She had no idea she had just handed me the key. But before I tell you what I did next, I should probably explain. This wasn't about a gate. It was never about the gate. The gate was merely the final arrogant punctuation mark on a story that had been unfolding for nearly a decade. To understand what happened, you have to understand the land, and you have to understand me. My name is Arthur Vance. I am 72 years old. For 45 years I was a licensed civil engineer and land surveyor. My firm, Vance & Associates, specialized in complex land use disputes, boundary resolutions, and large-scale municipal infrastructure projects. I didn't just read deeds and plats. I wrote them. At least I understood the intricate language of metes and bounds, of setbacks and easements, of riparian rights and title chains, as intimately as a poet understands rhyme and meter. It was the language of order, of clarity. On paper, everything had its place. My wife Eleanor used to joke that I could find happiness just by looking at a well-drafted survey map. She wasn't wrong. Eleanor passed away 6 years ago. We had bought this land together, 150 acres of rolling timberland, when we were young and foolish, and deeply in love. It was a buffer against the world, our own private kingdom of fir trees and silence. We built the house ourselves, with the help of my father and her brothers. It was a simple house, all wood and windows, designed to feel like a part of the forest, not an intrusion upon it. After she was gone, the silence in the house became heavier, but the silence of the woods remained a comfort. I found a new, quieter rhythm. My work had been about defining boundaries for others. My retirement was about living peacefully within my own. The Crestwood Pines development began about 10 years ago. A developer bought the failing farm that bordered my eastern property line and carved it up into 100 half-acre lots. It was advertised as luxury forest living. The houses were enormous, ostentatious things that seemed to be competing with each other for who could look most out of place. With the houses came the Homeowners Association, and with the HOA, eventually, came Karen Blackwood. Karen wasn't the first HOA president, but she was the most zealous. She was a woman who had, I suspect, found her life's true calling in the petty tyrannies of suburban governance. She had a gift for turning bylaws into weapons. In her first year, fines tripled. Mr. Henderson, a quiet retiree 3 streets in, was fined $2,000 because his mailbox, the same mailbox that had been approved by the previous board, was deemed a shade of beige inconsistent with the autumnal palette of the community. Mrs. Gable was threatened with a lien on her house for having a garden gnome visible from the street. The stories were legion. People paid. They grumbled, but they paid. It was easier than fighting. Karen cultivated an atmosphere of low-grade fear and exhaustion. My involvement began subtly. The road in question was an old logging trace that cut across the northern corner of my property. It was the most direct route from the county highway to the far side of what was now Crestwood Pines. For years the old farmer who owned the land, a man named Pat, had used it with my permission to move his equipment. When the first few houses went up, I allowed the new owners the same courtesy. It was a neighborly thing to do, a handshake agreement. They were careful, respectful. I never had a problem, but under Karen Blackwood, that informal courtesy began to be treated as an entitlement. More and more cars started using it, and they were driving faster. I started finding trash along the shoulders, Starbucks cups and fast food bags. One day, I came across a Crestwood Pines Community Watch sign, hammered into a tree 50 feet inside my property line. I pulled it out and left it lying on the asphalt of their cul-de-sac. That's when I started the folder. It wasn't a physical folder at first, but a directory on my computer, labeled simply HOA. I saved the first email from Karen. It accused me of vandalizing community property and demanded I cease and desist from interfering with the established access route. I didn't reply. I just saved the email as a PDF, along with the metadata showing when it was sent and from what IP address. I kept the receipts. I started paying attention. I attended a few HOA meetings, sitting quietly in the back of the clubhouse. I watched Karen perform. She was magnificent in her element, weaving tales of liability, property values, and the ever-present threat of community decline. She spoke of the access road as if the HOA owned it, a vital artery for their community. No one ever questioned her. When the HOA sent me a bill for $100 for unauthorized road maintenance, I had graded a section of my own road that had developed potholes. I paid it. I paid it with a cashier's check, and I sent it via certified mail. The check was my proof of payment, and the signed receipt was my proof they had received it. By cashing that check, they created a document acknowledging a financial transaction related to a road they claimed they owned. It was a beautiful little piece of contradictory evidence. I filed the canceled check and the green signature card in the folder. On paper, their story was already starting to unravel. The Pioneer Cabins project was Karen's magnum opus. 30 small, high-end vacation rentals to be built on a parcel of common land at the far end of the development. The idea was to generate income for the HOA, turning Crestwood Pines into a premier vacation destination. The only viable access for construction vehicles, and later for the renters, was my road. This was a different level of escalation. This was no longer about casual use. It was about commercial development. It was time for a formal warning. I drafted a letter. It was polite, professional, and unambiguous. I cited the book and page number of my deed. I included a copy of the most recent county survey plat, which I had personally updated and filed myself 2 years prior. On the plat, my property lines were drawn in thick, clear ink, and the road was labeled Private Drive, Vance Parcel. The letter stated clearly that any and all permissive use of the road was hereby revoked, and that any attempt to use it for construction or commercial purposes would be treated as trespassing. I sent this letter via certified mail, return receipt requested, addressed to Karen Blackwood and each of the other 4 members of the HOA board. A week later, all 5 green signature cards came back to my mailbox. They had received it. I scanned them and filed them away. The paper trail was now pristine. At the next HOA meeting which I attended, Karen held up my letter. "I received this threatening communication from Mr. Vance," she announced to the assembled residents. "He's trying to hold our community hostage to block the progress that will benefit us all." She crumpled the letter in her fist. "He seems to think a piece of paper is more powerful than years of established use. He thinks he can bully us. We will not be bullied. Our lawyers have assured me we have a clear case for a prescriptive easement, and we will proceed with the Pioneer Cabins as planned." There was a round of applause. She threw my letter, my carefully worded, legally significant warning, into a trash can. She had no idea she had just created another witness. The entire room of them. Mr. Henderson later told me he saw her fish it out of the trash after the meeting. She wasn't stupid, just arrogant. Arrogance was a more fatal flaw. I went home that night and made a decision. I was done observing. It was time to get to work. The next morning I didn't go out for my usual walk. I went into my home office, a room Eleanor had called my lair. It was lined with bookshelves filled with engineering manuals, legal texts, and rows of bound survey records. I sat down at my large oak desk, the same desk where I had solved boundary disputes for multinational corporations and untangled century-old title messes for small-town farmers. I was applying the skills of my entire professional life to a personal matter and I felt a calm, focused clarity settle over me. This was just another job, a problem to be solved, with data, documentation, and an unassailable understanding of the rules. My first call was to Ben Carter. Ben had been my lead paralegal and research specialist for 30 years before he retired, a year after I did. He was a wizard, a man who could navigate the labyrinthine archives of a county recorder's office like no one I'd ever met. He lived 3 states away now, but we still talked every few months. "Arthur," he said, his voice a familiar, gravelly welcome. "Don't tell me you've decided to unretire." "Not exactly, Ben," I said. "I have a personal project, a title and permit review. You interested in a little freelance work?" I explained the situation. I could hear the familiar click-clack of his keyboard as I spoke. Ben was always working. "HOA president, you say? Thinks historic use is a magic wand?" He chuckled. "I've seen this play before, Arthur. The script is always the same until someone shows up with a better one. Send me the parcel numbers for your land and the HOA common area. I'll start digging." While Ben went to work on the digital archives, I started my own assembly. I pulled out my master file, a heavy-duty accordion folder that contained the original deed from 1958 when my father bought the land, the title insurance policy, and every survey map ever drawn of the property, including my own. I laid them out on my drafting table, the old paper crinkling under the light. The chain of title was perfect, an unbroken line of ownership from the original land grant to me. There were no easements granted, no rights-of-way recorded, nothing. On paper, my ownership was absolute. Next, I activated the secret weapon. A few years back, after a piece of logging equipment was stolen from a remote corner of my property, I had installed a series of high-end cellular trail cameras. They were designed for wildlife tracking, motion-activated with night vision, and the ability to upload photos and videos directly to a secure cloud server. I had one positioned perfectly, hidden inside a hollowed-out log, with a clear view of the entrance to my road. I had let the subscription lapse, but it took me only 5 minutes online to reactivate it. From that moment on, every vehicle, every person that entered my road would be recorded, time-stamped, and saved. Then, I began the slow, methodical work for a quiet title action. A quiet title is a lawsuit you file to clarify ownership of a property, to remove any competing claims or clouds on the title. In this case, the HOA's baseless claim of a prescriptive easement was a cloud. To win, I needed to present an overwhelming, irrefutable body of evidence, so I started building it. I printed out every email from Karen. I made high-resolution scans of the certified mail receipts and the cashed check for the road maintenance fee. I downloaded the video I had taken of the gate installation. I began a daily log, noting every time an HOA-related vehicle used my road. A week later, Ben called. "Arthur, you're not going to believe this," he said. There was a note of genuine excitement in his voice, the sound of a treasure hunter who had just struck gold. "I've been going through the County Planning Commission archives for the Crestwood Pines development. I found the original master plan and the environmental impact report from 10 years ago. And," I prompted, leaning forward in my chair, "the parcel they're building these cabins on, HOA Common Area C, it was never zoned for residential or commercial construction. It was designated as a non-buildable drainage and conservation easement. It's supposed to be a buffer zone to handle stormwater runoff from the rest of the development. The original developer dedicated it to the county as a green space in exchange for higher density zoning on the rest of the land." I felt a cold thrill go through me. This was more than I had hoped for. "So, how did they get building permits?" "That's the million-dollar question," Ben said. "I pulled the permit applications. They're recent, from about 6 months ago, and the survey map attached to the application. Arthur, it's a forgery, a bad one." "Send it to me," I said, my voice low. The file arrived in my inbox a minute later. I opened it. Ben was right. It was an amateurish job. They had taken an old plat of the development and clumsily altered it with some kind of graphics software. They had changed the designation of Common Area C from conservation easement to zoned for ancillary structures. They had also subtly shifted the property line on the map, making my private road appear to be a public right-of-way named Pioneer Lane, and at the bottom, in the space reserved for the surveyor's signature and seal, was a crude copy-paste of a seal belonging to a surveyor I knew. A good man named George Klein, who had retired 5 years ago and moved to Florida. But the most damning part was the signature next to the seal. It was a messy looping scrawl that read, Karen Blackwood, with the title, Acting Agent for Surveyor. She hadn't even bothered to forge George's signature. She had, in her boundless arrogance, signed her own name to a fraudulent document, a document she then submitted to the county as a true and accurate representation of the property. She had no idea the kind of fire she was playing with. This wasn't a civil dispute anymore. This was a felony. I saved the file. I printed it out in high resolution. I placed it carefully into a new, separate folder labeled Exhibit A. The foundation of my case was no longer just about property rights. It was about fraud. Construction began 2 weeks later. The first vehicles to arrive were the excavators, great yellow beasts that tore at the earth, their engines a constant low growl that vibrated through my floorboards. They came right down my road, past my house, without so much as a wave. My cameras captured every one of them. I documented the name of the construction company on the side of the trucks. I took photos of the mud and debris they tracked onto the road. I kept the receipts. The framing went up with astonishing speed. 30 identical little cabins, crammed together on a patch of land that was supposed to be a meadow for filtering rainwater. I watched them go up, a monument to Karen Blackwood's hubris. Every day, I added to my file. Photos, videos, log entries. The paper trail grew thicker, heavier, an anchor of facts in a sea of her fiction. The day they finished, the day the last construction vehicle rolled out, and the rental management company's sign went up. Pioneer Cabins at Crestwood, your rustic luxury escape, was the day I made my next move. I had a local company, the same one the HOA had used, install a gate of my own. It was a heavy-duty steel gate, agricultural grade, with a thick chain and 2 formidable-looking padlocks. I had them sink the posts 6 feet deep in concrete-filled holes, right at the entrance to my road, just off the county highway. When they were done, I thanked them, paid them in cash, and locked the gate. Then I waited. It took less than 24 hours. The first vacationing family, a couple with 2 young children in a gleaming Suburban, was scheduled to check in at 3 p.m. on a Friday. I watched from my porch as they pulled up to the new gate, their expressions shifting from happy anticipation to confusion, then to annoyance. The husband got out, pulled on the gate, saw the locks, and got back in his car. He made a call. 20 minutes later, Karen Blackwood's white SUV came squealing to a halt on the shoulder of the highway. She got out, saw the gate, and her face turned a shade of crimson I had not thought humanly possible. She marched up to the gate and yanked on it futilely. Then she pulled out her phone. I knew who she was calling. A sheriff's deputy arrived 15 minutes later. A young man looked like he was barely out of his 20s, with a calm, professional demeanor. I watched as Karen launched into her performance. She waved her arms, her voice shrill with indignation. I could almost hear the words from my porch. Illegal blockade, endangering families, crazy old man. The deputy listened patiently, nodding. Then he walked over to the gate, examined it, and walked the 50 feet down the road to where the HOA's own gate was installed. He looked back and forth between the two. Then he started walking toward my house. I met him on the porch. "Afternoon, sir," he said, his hand resting lightly on his belt. "I'm Deputy Miller. We've had a complaint about a public road being blocked." "Good afternoon, Deputy," I said calmly. "There must be some mistake. This is not a public road. This is my private driveway." Karen had followed him up the path, and she sputtered from behind him. "That's a lie. It's Pioneer Lane. It's on all our maps." The deputy held up a hand to quiet her, a gesture that was both polite and firm. He turned back to me. "Can you show me any documentation to that effect, sir?" "Of course," I said. I stepped inside and returned a moment later with a slim file folder. I didn't give him the whole mountain of evidence. I gave him only what was necessary for this specific moment. I handed him 3 documents: a certified copy of my property deed, the official recorded county tax map of my parcel, and my driver's license. He took the documents and examined them carefully. He looked at the deed, his eyes tracing the legal description of the property boundaries. He looked at the tax map, which clearly showed the road contained entirely within the lines of my parcel, with no mention of an easement or right-of-way. He looked at my license, confirming my name and address. "This all appears to be in order, Mr. Vance," he said, handing the documents back to me. He then turned to Karen. "Ma'am, according to the official county records, this road is on private property belonging to this gentleman." Karen's face was a mask of disbelief. But the prescriptive easement. We've been using it for years. He's trapping my guests. You have to make him open it." Deputy Miller sighed, the weary sigh of an officer who has to explain the law to someone who doesn't want to hear it. "Ma'am, a prescriptive easement is a civil claim. It's something you have to prove in court. It doesn't give you the right to install gates on someone else's property, and it doesn't give me the authority to force him to remove a gate from his own property. As it stands, your guests and your gate down there are on his land. This is a civil matter. You'll need to contact an attorney." He was a good deputy. He saw the facts, he understood the limits of his authority, and he applied the law correctly. "Deputy," I said, speaking for the first time since the conversation began. "For the record, and for your report, I would like to state that I am the legal owner of this property. I have never granted an easement to the Crestwood Pines HOA. The HOA and its contractors have been trespassing for months despite my written warnings. They have now installed a gate on my property without my permission, and this woman has just falsely reported to a law enforcement officer that I have blocked a public road. I would appreciate it if all of that was accurately reflected in your incident report." The deputy's eyes met mine. I saw a flicker of understanding, perhaps even respect. He nodded slowly. "Noted, sir." He turned to Karen. "Ma'am, I suggest you have your guests turn around. There's nothing more I can do here." He walked back to his patrol car, leaving Karen Blackwood standing in my driveway, sputtering in impotent rage. The vacationing family in the Suburban, having watched the entire exchange, backed out onto the highway and drove away. The body camera on Deputy Miller's uniform had recorded the entire 30-minute encounter. His report, which I would later obtain through a public records request, was a masterpiece of neutral, factual language that nonetheless painted a damning portrait of Karen's behavior. It became another document in my growing collection. The paper trail was now reinforced with an official police record. She had no idea how much damage she had just done to herself. The confrontation with the deputy seemed to be a catalyst. The story of the trapped cabins spread through Crestwood Pines like wildfire. For Karen's supporters, I was the villain, a spiteful old hermit holding families hostage. But for others, the ones who had been quietly suffering under her reign, it was a crack in the dam. 2 days later, on a Sunday evening, there was a hesitant knock on my door. It was Mr. Henderson, the man who had been fined for his beige mailbox. He was a small, timid man, a retired accountant who always seemed to be hunched over, as if expecting a blow. He was holding a worn shoe box. "Mr. Vance," he said, his voice barely a whisper. I heard what happened with the gate." "Come in, Mr. Henderson," I said, holding the door open. He sat stiffly on the edge of my sofa, the shoebox clutched in his lap. "I'm not a brave man, Mr. Vance," he began, looking at his hands. "Karen, she has a way of making you feel small. That business with the mailbox, it wasn't about the money. It was about the humiliation. She made me repaint it 3 times, held a special meeting to approve the final shade." He finally looked up at me, his eyes pleading. "But what you did, standing up to her, to the sheriff. It made me think, maybe I've been a coward for too long. He opened the shoebox. Inside were dozens of small cassette tapes and a small, handheld voice recorder. I started recording the HOA board meetings after the mailbox incident, he said, just for my own protection, in case she tried to lie about something else. I have everything, every threat, every lie for the last 3 years. My heart beat a little faster. This was an unexpected gift. Eyewitness testimony was powerful, but audio recordings were irrefutable. I have the meeting where she talked about your letter, he said, his hands trembling as he sorted through the tapes. The one you sent by certified mail. She told the board she was going to ignore it. She said, and I remember the exact words, "Who's he going to complain to? By the time he gets a lawyer, the cabins will be built, and will have so much established use that no judge will ever side with him." He found the tape and held it out to me. "Here," he said. "I'll testify. I'll tell them everything." He represented the conscience of the community, the quiet majority who had been cowed into silence. His testimony would give a human face to Karen's pattern of abuse. The day after Mr. Henderson's visit, I received an email from a disposable anonymous address. The subject line was simply HOA Financials. The email contained a single attachment, a PDF scan of a legal opinion from a law firm. It was addressed to the Crestwood Pines HOA board and dated 6 months prior, right after I had sent my certified letter. The opinion was clear. The law firm had strongly advised the board that their claim of a prescriptive easement was weak and unlikely to succeed in court. They had specifically warned against proceeding with any construction that relied on access via my road, stating it would expose the HOA to significant legal and financial liability. At the bottom of the document was a handwritten note. Karen buried this. The rest of the board never saw it. She hired a new, cheaper lawyer a week later. Good luck. I knew it had to be from one of the board members, the disillusioned insider. I later learned it was a woman named Sarah, a young mother who had joined the board, hoping to improve the community playground, and had found herself trapped in Karen's web. This document was the smoking gun. It proved that Karen had not just been arrogant or ignorant. She had been explicitly warned by her own legal counsel and had willfully concealed that information from her fellow board members and the community. She had knowingly and deliberately led them into this disaster. Armed with this new evidence, I hired a lawyer of my own, not just any lawyer, but the best land use attorney in the state, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Ms. Albright. I didn't need her to fight for me. I needed her to be the formal vessel for the evidence I had already gathered. When I laid out the files on her conference table, the deeds, the surveys, the certified mail receipts, the photos, the videos, the police report, Mr. Henderson's audio tapes, the concealed legal opinion, and finally, the fraudulent permit application, she was silent for a full minute. She looked up at me, a slow smile spreading across her face. "Mr. Vance," she said, "this isn't a case, it's a demolition." Karen, meanwhile, was getting desperate. The cabins sat empty. The rental company was threatening to sue the HOA for breach of contract. The vacationers were posting scathing one-star reviews online. Her grand vision was turning into a public and financial nightmare, so she made one last, desperate, and over-the-top move. I was served with a temporary restraining order. In her sworn affidavit, Karen claimed I had been harassing her, that I had threatened her and the renters, and that my menacing presence and illegal blockade had caused her severe emotional distress. She claimed to be in fear for her safety. It was a work of pure fiction, a collection of lies so audacious they were almost impressive. And it had been signed under penalty of perjury. A hearing was set for the following week. This was the final piece. Her last, frantic escalation was a sworn statement to the court that we could now prove, in meticulous detail, was a complete fabrication. It was perjury, added to the growing list of fraud and forgery. She had no idea she had just built her own gallows. The courtroom was small and stuffy, smelling of old paper and cheap air freshener. It was packed. On one side sat Karen Blackwood, flanked by her new, inexpensive lawyer and a handful of her staunchest supporters from the HOA. They looked grim and self-righteous. On the other side sat myself and Miss Albright. Behind us were Mr. Henderson, Sarah the former board member, and a dozen other Crestwood residents who had finally decided they had had enough. The vacationers whose reservations had been canceled were there too, summoned by Ms. Albright. The air was thick with tension. The hearing was for Karen's restraining order against me. It was her motion, so she went first. She took the stand and delivered a breathtaking performance. Her voice trembled. She dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. She painted a picture of a peaceful community terrorized by a hostile and irrational old man. She spoke of the public road, Pioneer Lane, that I had maliciously blocked, trapping innocent families. She spoke of my threatening gestures and constant, menacing surveillance. She described her fear, her sleepless nights, her concern for the safety of her residents. It was a masterclass in performative victimhood. Her lawyer concluded by stating, "Your Honor, my client is in fear for her life. We are simply asking the court to order Mr. Vance to cease his harassment and remove the illegal obstruction to a public thoroughfare." The judge, a stern-faced woman named Judge Marion, looked over at us. "Ms. Albright, your response." Ms. Albright rose slowly. "Your Honor," she began, her voice calm and clear, "we will demonstrate that not only is every single statement Ms. Blackwood just made under oath a material falsehood, but that this entire situation is the result of a deliberate, fraudulent scheme orchestrated by Ms. Blackwood herself." A murmur went through the courtroom. Karen's lawyer shot to his feet. "Objection, counsel is making baseless accusations." "Overruled," the judge said, her eyes fixed on Ms. Albright. "Proceed." Ms. Albright didn't call me to the stand. She didn't need to. She let the documents speak for themselves. She began by placing a certified copy of my deed and the official county plat map on the projector. "Your Honor, this is the deed to the property owned by my client, Mr. Arthur Vance, and this is the official county survey. As you can see, the road in question, which Mr. Vance calls his driveway and Ms. Blackwood calls Pioneer Lane, is located entirely within the boundaries of Mr. Vance's private property. There is no Pioneer Lane. It does not exist." Next, she played the audio from Deputy Miller's body camera. The courtroom listened as Karen's shrill, entitled voice filled the room, followed by the deputy's calm, methodical explanation of the law. Then came the certified mail receipts. "Your Honor, these are 5 signed receipts confirming that Miss Blackwood and the entire HOA board were formally notified in writing, months before construction began, that they had no legal right to access my client's property." She played the tape from Mr. Henderson's recorder, the one where Karen told the board she was going to ignore my letter and proceed anyway. Karen, sitting at the plaintiff's table, went pale. Next, the concealed legal opinion. "This is a legal opinion, Your Honor, from the HOA's own former attorneys, explicitly warning Ms. Blackwood against this course of action, a warning she concealed from her colleagues." Sarah, the former board member, was called to the stand to authenticate the document. Her testimony was quiet, but devastating. Ms. Albright was building a wall of evidence, brick by painstaking brick. With each new exhibit, Karen Blackwood seemed to shrink in her chair. Her lawyer sat beside her, his face a mask of growing horror as he realized the case he had taken on was a house of cards in a hurricane. Then came the final, crushing blow. "And finally, Your Honor," Albright said, her voice dropping slightly for dramatic effect, "we come to the matter of the construction itself. Ms. Blackwood was able to obtain building permits from the county only by submitting this document." She placed the fraudulent survey map on the projector, the clumsy edits, the fake road name, the altered zoning designation. It was all there, magnified for the entire courtroom to see. "This document purports to be a certified survey map. It is, in fact, a forgery," The seal of the surveyor, Mr. George Klein, was used without his knowledge or permission, and the person who signed this fraudulent document, attesting to its accuracy as an acting agent, was Ms. Karen Blackwood herself. A collective gasp went through the room. All eyes turned to Karen. The color had drained completely from her face. The mask was gone. There was no more performance, no more indignation, just the blank, hollow-eyed panic of someone who has been so thoroughly and completely caught that there is no escape. She stared at the projection screen, at her own looping signature on the fraudulent document, as if seeing it for the first time. In that moment she finally understood the depth of her miscalculation. She understood that this quiet, elderly man she had dismissed as a pushover had not been sleeping. He had been working. He had been keeping the receipts. The judge stared at the document on the screen for a long, silent moment. She took off her glasses and rubbed the bridge of her nose. When she spoke, her voice was cold as ice. "Miss Blackwood," she said, "please stand up." Karen rose on trembling legs. "The request for a temporary restraining order is denied with extreme prejudice," the judge said, her voice sharp and ringing with authority. "Furthermore, based on the evidence presented here today, which includes what appears to be felony-grade forgery, submission of a fraudulent instrument to a government agency, and blatant perjury committed in my courtroom this morning, I am referring this entire matter to the district attorney's office for immediate criminal investigation." She looked at Karen's lawyer. "Counselor, I suggest you advise your client that she has the right to remain silent." The gavel came down with a crack that echoed the shattering of Karen Blackwood's world. The aftermath was swift and brutal. The district attorney's office filed charges against Karen within a month. She was charged with multiple counts of forgery, filing a false instrument, and perjury. Faced with the mountain of evidence I had compiled, she took a plea bargain. She pleaded guilty to 2 felony counts, was sentenced to 5 years of probation, ordered to pay a hefty fine, and was legally barred from ever serving on any corporate or community board again. The HOA was a different kind of casualty. The rental management company sued them for breach of contract and fraud. The families who had booked the cabins filed a class action lawsuit. Ms. Albright, on my behalf, filed the quiet title action, along with a suit for damages related to trespassing and the cost of repairing my road. The HOA's insurance carrier took one look at the case, particularly the evidence that Karen had ignored the advice of her own lawyers, and denied their claim. The HOA was forced to declare a form of bankruptcy. They had to levy a massive special assessment on every homeowner in Crestwood Pines, just to cover the legal fees and settlement costs. The 30 pioneer cabins, inaccessible and uninsurable, were a total loss. A court order mandated their removal. Karen Blackwood's name became a curse in the community she had once ruled with an iron fist. She and her husband sold their house at a loss and moved away in the middle of the night. The community began to heal. A new board was elected, with Sarah as the president and Mr. Henderson as the treasurer. Their first act was to formally rescind every fine Karen had ever levied. They sent me a letter, a formal apology on behalf of the entire community, and a check for the $100 road maintenance fee I had paid years ago. They also paid for the demolition of their own gate on my property. One Saturday morning, a few months after the court hearing, I watched as a demolition crew arrived. They used cutting torches to slice apart the offending HOA gate, the one that had started it all, and hauled it away for scrap. Then, their convoy of heavy equipment rumbled past my house, down my newly graded road, to the site of the ill-fated cabins. For a week, the air was filled with the sounds of destruction, of wood splintering and metal groaning, as the 30 cabins were torn down to their foundations. When they were finished, they trucked out the debris and seeded the bare earth with native grasses. My neighbors, who had once averted their eyes, now waved when I drove past. Some stopped by with baked goods or offers to help with yard work. They didn't talk about what happened, not directly. They didn't have to. There was a new, quiet respect in their eyes. I was no longer the strange old man in the woods. I was the man who had shown them that a piece of paper, when it tells the truth, is more powerful than any bully. I sit on my porch now, in the quiet of the evening with a cup of tea. The mist is settling back onto the firs. Where the 30 cabins once stood, there is now just a greening meadow. The land is healing. The silence has returned, deeper and more peaceful than before. My gate, the one I installed, remains at the head of my road. It's not locked with a heavy chain anymore, just a simple latch. It's a boundary, not a barricade. A quiet statement of fact. On the central post, I've affixed a small, custom-made bronze plaque. It doesn't have my name on it. It just has the parcel number from the county records and a single year. 1958. The year my father bought this land. The year the story of this place, on paper, truly began. I think about ownership, about what it really means. It's not about dominance or control. It's about stewardship. It's about respecting the lines, both on the map and between people. Karen Blackwood never understood that. She saw a line and wanted to erase it, to bend reality to her will. She believed in the power of performance, of loud assertion. I believe in the quiet power of the record, of the patient, methodical accumulation of truth. In the end, her story, built on lies and intimidation, collapsed into dust. Mine, written in ink on deeds and survey maps, remains. The land endures. The paper trail is permanent, and the gate, my gate, is closed.